All right, so again, the coral reef is defined by this animal we know as the coral, which is, as I said, related to sea anemones. These animals that have tentacles, each individual coral is quite small, but collectively they make up this large community. And what happens, they have a shell that they deposit, and over time, this shell, one builds on top of another, which makes this structure we know as coral. And they're quite diverse and productive, and again, they're found in warm waters, tropical areas. Curiously enough, in spite of this, um, this productivity and diversity occurs in spite of nutrient poor water. That's why the water in tropical areas, particularly around coral reefs, is clear. It's because it's very low in nutrients. Um, you see something analogous, well, not analogous, but similar with tropical rainforests as well. The soils around tropical rainforests are quite nutrient poor. It's because all the nutrients are tied up in the living things, and so you see essentially the same thing here. The nutrients are all in the living things, and little of it's in the water. The things quickly use any nutrients that get into the water. Um, all right, coral reefs. There's some significant threats that from human action. Sedimentation. So if coral reefs are found around rivers where there's a lot of sediment coming down there, that can essentially bury the coral reef. All this water coming in from rivers can bring nutrients with them, particularly things again from farms and from urban and suburban areas, which can lead to eutrophication, which is when sort of the nutrient load in an aquatic system, be it of any kind, increases, then the biomass of algae increases, and this can make the water kind of cloudy, and that's can be a problem for certain other types of organisms. Um, Also, when all those algae then begin to die, it increases the amount of organic waste in the water, which leads to an increase in decomposition, decomposing organisms. And those decomposers tend to use oxygen out of the water. And so waters that become eutrophic with all these nutrients, all this algae, and then the algae begin to die, their oxygen levels can decrease to the extent that these areas can become anoxic or so low in oxygen it's hard for aerobic organisms to live. Um, Also, in some parts of the globe, there's been a warming trend in the oceans, and and that sounds a little counterintuitive because tropical waters are warm, but when they get a little too warm, that can be a problem for corals. You may know that corals are actually a symbiosis between the coral animal and algae that live with the coral in the reef, not in the water, but with the animal in direct contact. And apparently, when the waters get too warm, the algae tend to die or leave the coral, and then the coral animal can't really survive anymore because it depends on the algae for some of its food. And so this leads to what's called coral bleaching when they die and just turn white. Um, Ocean acidification is a problem as well. Um, what happens there is when you have CO2 increasing in the air, which is the trend that's been happening for several hundred years now, um, some of that CO2, as the amount of CO2 in the air increases, it means that there's more CO2 diffusing into bodies of water. And when that CO2 mixes with the water, it forms this stuff H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. And so that can decrease the pH of the water. And this becomes a problem, particularly in marine systems, because you have a lot of animals like corals that have to build a shell, and the material, which is known as calcium carbonate, primarily that they use to build their shells, um, at lower pHs, this calcium carbonate tends to precipitate out of the water. That is, it basically sinks to the bottom. Instead of being dissolved in the water and available to these animals to build shells, it sinks out of the water and there's less of it available. So the uh, point is that it becomes these animals to build their shells, clams, oysters, corals, things like that. All right, now another type of nearshore habitat and in the shallower oceans is the seagrass beds. And so these are areas that are inundated all the time. They're below the tide line, but they're dominated by not really grass-like organisms, um, and they can be found in both temperate and tropical areas, but they have a fair amount of sediment, and so they're not coral areas, but it's where the bottom kind of becomes covered with sediment, and these grass-like plants basically grow out of the sediment. The plants provides food for many organisms. You can see here this sea anemone. They like to hang out in these seagrass beds. Some of the fish eat them, and then of course there are fish that eat those fish. This sea turtle. Um, Eutrophication can also overstimulate growth of these grasses and get the system out of balance. And when corals have a significant amount of sedimentation and might be essentially buried in sediment, the area can switch from a coral reef to one of these seagrass beds. Um, all right, when we go into somewhat cooler waters, we can get into what we call the kelp forests, and they're found around the Pacific Northwest, and the northern stretches of the Pacific on the Asian side around Japan and such. And they're dominated by kelps, which is a type of algae, brown algae, and you can see they get quite large. They grow from the bottom, and they can grow several tens of meters up to the surface, and they provide good habitat for a variety of organisms. Um, and as you may remember, for those of you who were in the fall semester, we talked about the sea otters as a part of this community and the important role they play as a keystone species there. Um, The kelps themselves, again, these large plant-like things, these brown algae, they're not woody by any means, and so what holds them up in the water column is having these structures that are full of air that basically give them buoyancy and allow them to remain suspended in the water column. Um, all right, so now we go to the open ocean, rather deep, and this part of the open ocean that's over deep waters, which is known as the pelagic zone. So we're beyond the continental shelf. Of course, there's going to be phytoplankton and zooplankton out there, as there is in large bodies of water anywhere. We also have, and then here's some zooplankton and phytoplankton. Then we also have what's called the nekton, and the nekton are the swimming animals in the water, in the pelagic zone, the powerful swimmers. And here we have bluefin tuna, this relatively large fish, a predator of the open oceans, also prized as sushi, particularly by the Japanese. Bluefin tuna populations have decreased significantly because of their value. You also have some birds that spend significant amounts of time in the open ocean, these pelagic seabirds. And here's a waved albatross, a rather large bird that, while it does nest at the shore and raise its young at the shore, when it's feeding, it can spend considerable amount of time out in the open ocean. Just basically, it can float on the water like a duck, but then it'll also dive down into the water to catch fish. Um, Back in the day, fishermen would see an albatross as a sign that somewhere land is close. We must not be too far. Um, and it was considered bad luck on a ship if you um, killed an albatross. All right, so now when we're out in the open ocean, but now we go down below the photic zone, it's dark, and you see some of these really bizarre looking creatures, these really spiny fish with all these teeth. And you also see animals characterized by bioluminescence. That is, they can have parts of their body where they can carry out a reaction that will create light. Same thing that fireflies do, but it's very common down there. And some of them use them as these structures, like right here, that they use as lures. They light up and they wave them around and they try to attract other fish close to them. And then when that fish is close, they will eat them. Um, Here's on the left this rather scary looking this thing called a lanternfish, and its eyes light up due to bioluminescence. And you see some like this one on the right here that again their species, if you will, has evolved in the depths for so long that they'll sometimes just lose any pigmentation they have because there's no light down there, so there's no reason to have pigments. Um, this fish, the reason it's light there now is because the device, the submarine, whatever, has used a flash to light it up so it can take a picture. Um, Now, in the benthos of oceans, the really deep parts, they tend to be rather sparsely populated and, of course, quite cold, very high pressure from all that water above. Trying to do research and collect some of these organisms is difficult because when you bring them to the surface, the pressure is much lower and they tend not to hold together very well. Um, Most of the food that gets down there there's no photosynthesis or anything like that, obviously. It comes from nutrients that rain down from above, so things that die and sink to the bottom provide food for things at the bottom. Now, there are these unique habitats at the bottom, not found throughout the oceans, but in certain spots, particularly where the crust is thin. You have what are called hydrothermal vents. And this is where water seeps down into the crust and is heated by magma that's relatively close to the surface at these breaks in the crust. It heats that water up, and the water comes spewing out of the seafloor and sort of forms these little chimney-like structures that the water's spewing out. It's full of all sorts of um, compounds and minerals and such, and it's also extremely hot. And so it heats up the water in the surroundings, so it creates these little islands of diversity in the benthic region. You have all these strange creatures like these tube worms, and you can see this crab here that's completely white. Again, it has no pigmentation, and some of the animals down there don't have any eyes because, again, they can't see because there's nothing to see because it's really dark. Um, so these are areas that have not been studied a whole lot because, again, they can be thousands of feet down, and it's hard to study them to any extent. Um, all right. Now, with people, of course, marine systems have been used for centuries, obviously as a source of food, fishermen and such. There've also been areas that are good at sort of absorbing nutrients and dealing with them, although we, in more modern times, have begun to add too many nutrients to certain parts of them, leading to eutrophication. Overall, oceans are good at stabilizing climate because all that water can absorb a lot of heat, or basically, as we talked about earlier, move heat around the planet. So they have big impacts on the climate. Obviously for recreation, which includes going out fishing and stuff like that. So overfishing is an issue. Um, Certain fisheries have been said to collapse. COP. Dang, I didn't spell that word very well. Have been said to collapse. That is, the species is not necessarily extinct, but its population is so low that there's just very few out there to catch anymore, and that has happened at times. Again, adding all those nutrients can lead to eutrophication, and so in certain estuaries, you get what are called dead zones, where so many nutrients have added, and it's so anoxic that little can live there. And acidification, as we talked about a little earlier. All right.